I've spent many years teaching in development studies in London, and within development studies, there's really, until very recently, been this huge silence around race. Although, I see it as extremely central, not just in terms of like a kind of a legacy of colonialism, although that's important, but I think in day-to-day practices and in overarching structures, we have to look at race, and racialization is absolutely central. But I suppose the other thing has been my sort of kind of solidarity activism, which is partly linked to South Asia and also kind of making links with struggles in Britain and South Asia. And most recently kind of inevitably has also focused on the rise of the Hindu right and so on. Through all of that, population discourses were coming to the fore as part of that.
Well, I came into reframing and rethinking population through actually working with Betsy Hartman.
Right.
And what made so much sense to me is it was holding powerful players accountable, including the U.S. government in terms of the U.S. international development agencies, donors, and the multiple actors who are working together to think about population, and really addressed the power flows and the lack of nuance. Yes? So there were proponents of population control everywhere, and so it wasn't just coming from the U.S., but the U.S.'s outsized role, and how I think it's a really important thing to critique that as being in the U.S. and being from the U.S. and trying to understand how to shift that. Yeah. And you brought up the youth bulge, so this idea that sort of was percolating in the 70s as the worries about hordes of young people sort of uprising from the newly decolonized areas, and how that theory has in the last 15 years become common knowledge, as these things do in development, right? It goes from being this theory of a few people and then becomes what you read in the headlines every day.
Absolutely.
Increased militarization or environmental degradation and climate change, all these problems that have been variously blamed on population. When you rethink population, it has a chance to turn the frame and hold people accountable, hold institutions accountable.
A lot of population interventions are about like changing individual behavior. And, again, I mean, that's something which even goes beyond population in so many kinds of development interventions, thinking about it in terms of, HIV and AIDS, and many people have written about this, and the whole kind of behavioral approach and what's really problematic about it. It also links up to this whole very neoliberal idea that, people can manage their own poverty, that people have this sort of, entrepreneurial potential, and basically everyone can make it if they try hard enough. So that whole notion of kind of individual responsibility, which comes to be challenged.
Yeah, which it does, and it's what even beyond the responsibility for self, if you were talking about responsibility for spurring economic growth in your nation, responsibility for being a steward of the environment, all of these ways in which it takes the onus off of structures and governments and social services and places it squarely on the person, and as you were saying, to be more productive.
It's quite seductive the way in which there's now so many, we see so many images and so many kinds of media which kind of projects this idea of particularly women, particularly in the global south, as being kind of really hyper industrious and really incredibly entrepreneurial and having this sort of boundless energy. I think on one level, it appears like a welcome change from all of those images of women as passive, as, which were themselves very colonial, passive victims waiting to be saved. And this is supposed to be, much more dynamic, agentic kind of image. And I think the point is, that we have to see how those new images really fit in with this whole approach, and how they're also very racialized. This whole idea of the woman who's kind of endlessly productive, endlessly laboring, endlessly contented within a given order. It's really interesting to look at how you had those images in colonial period.
One of the trends of people not having children in order to save the planet, sort of as a green act. One of the things that does is it devalues people. It's narrowing people and their possibilities to really just environmental degradation over a lifetime. And I think that by pointing out that people have possibilities, that they're just not an automatic impact on the environment, that people can have positive impact on the environment, that we could have indifferent and conflicting impacts on the environment, it really opens up a different conversation. And I think that can also call into question the idea why people are so frequently placed outside of nature as something that is, we're completely in our own sphere.
I mean, that separation is so much associated with capitalism, isn't it? So
people cite it as sort of coming from industrialization. So it's like this post-industrial period, and before that, perhaps we were more attuned to nature or more part of nature.
I mean, I think for me the biggest challenge really is around the way in which a lot of population conventional wisdom has now linked it to reproductive rights. I think it's very important to kind of reclaim that whole arena. I mean, I think that's, to some extent it's happened with the reproductive justice movement and so on, but it's like a continual battle, really.
Right. The unspoken and spoken choices that you can't have children.
Yeah, exactly.
Or you're a bad environmental steward. Yeah.
So I think the whole win-win idea has to be really debunked.
Yeah.
I feel very much the starting point has to be where you are, and the kind of struggles which you're engaging with where you are. I think Chandra Mohanty's written about this very well, actually, in her 2003 article, where she says that, of course, we must recognize difference, and we must always keep that central and recognize that we can't make assumptions about the similarity of experiences. We must, of course, always be very aware of kind of privileges and imbalances of power, but we should also within that always look at like the overarching structures, which link experiences in very different places, and I think that's so key.
I like the idea that there's not one trajectory that we're ever going to be on together, so that allowing for multiple ideas of what is needed and recognizing that will be the way that we, as you were saying, there's many different feminisms, there's many different ways to futures that are neither perfect nor a disaster, right? I think that within that, as you're saying, like finding places of solidarity and having the potential for solidarity to really mean something across and through and because of differences, and that because we think the issues are more important, realizing, I think, getting beyond sort of identity as an individual and identity as maybe a small group, but sort of trying to find each other across spaces. We assume disaster right now in all ways, sort of militaristically, in terms of terrorism or the war on terror or the various ways it's talked about, and climate disaster, climate war. I mean, we're laden with this heavy set of vocabularies and how do we create a new one? I don't know.
There is actually quite a kind of powerful move to kind of make invisible those kinds of resistances and those kind of movements which represent some kind of hope for the future, because the positive messages which are put out by development organizations and by by the media and so on are always in a particular mold, which is, as I was saying, this whole idea of the sort of the individual triumphing and the sort of, the entrepreneur and the fact that all this has been facilitated by these institutions, by aid, by, and what this does is kind of, it actually completely invisibilizes the political arena, of people's struggles, of social movements, which are actually much more kind of transformative in their goals. So I think that's something which also, making those things visible is really important.